Today on Uncommon Knowledge, is the right on the right track?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, how the conservative movement has transformed the American political landscape. In 1964, the conservative Republican Barry Goldwater ran against the Democrat Lyndon Johnson and lost in a landslide. In 1980, the conservative Republican Ronald Reagan ran against the Democrat Jimmy Carter and won in a landslide. And just 4 years later, when Ronald Reagan ran against the Democrat Walter Mondale, he won in an even bigger landslide, carrying 49 out of 50 states. How did that happen? And for the conservative movement in America, what comes next? Joining us, two guests. Clark Judge was a speechwriter for President Reagan. He's now the managing director of the White House Writers Group. John Micklethwait is U.S. editor of The Economist magazine and co-author of The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America. President George W. Bush, this past spring at the 40th anniversary of the American Conservative Union, quote, "The conservative movement has become the dominant intellectual force in American politics," close quote. That is a true or false question, John?
I think it's true, definitely.
Unqualified.
I would qualify it in some ways. I would say that from some perspectives, there are signs of rebirth a little bit on the liberal side. But if you look over the past generation, I think there's no doubt where most of the ideas have been coming from, and they've been coming from the right.
You will simply grant your assent?
I agree with that. The intellectual drive of the United States for the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades really, has been from the right. The left has had resurgences, but even the left, at least those parts of the left that have moved into government at the White House level, Bill Clinton's administration, have been strongly influenced by the right and have been pushed to the right.
All right. 1964, conservative Republican Barry Goldwater runs for president against Democrat Lyndon Johnson and loses in a landslide. John Kenneth Galbraith speaking in that year, quote, "These without doubt are the years of the liberal. Almost everyone now so describes himself." 16 years later, 1980, conservative Republican Ronald Reagan runs for president against Democrat Jimmy Carter and wins in a landslide. And indeed, 4 years later, when Reagan runs for re-election against Walter Mondale, he carries 49 out of 50 states and receives more votes than any other presidential candidate in American history. How did that happen?
Well, I think Galbraith, to some extent, was right. It sounds rather smug saying everyone I know now is a liberal. But back in the 1960s, at that particular time, the elites who were driving things were definitely from the left. They had hopes, I think, of Europeanizing, to use a terrible word, Europeanizing America. There was a time when support for the death penalty dropped massively. It was a time when people thought they could bring in affirmative action, the Great Society. The Great Society actually comes from a British socialist phrase, the Great Society. And it was a time when people thought that way, but it stirred up a reaction in conservative America, and that is pushed the way towards Reagan. But it wasn't just a matter of a reaction, it was also a matter of building things. There was a lot of institutions, there was a lot of think tanks, there was a lot of thought which came up on the right.
Ronald Reagan used to say that he hadn't left the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party left him. To what extent is it a case of the nation doesn't actually become more conservative? The great center of the nation doesn't change, particularly from 64 to 80. What happens is that the Democratic Party moves left and the GOP moves in to capture the center.
There's a little bit of truth in that. It's certainly true the Democrats moved to the left. I think one could, on the other hand, if you look at the GOP, I think you have to say they moved to the right. If you go back, an easiest way to look at it is the Bush family. Look at Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush is the grandfather of George W. Bush. His ideology you could reduce to just being roughly along the lines of government's a pretty good thing. Strong supporter of birth control.
Be careful. He actually knew Prescott Bush.
Well, I did actually know Prescott Bush.
But I'm stereotyping it slightly. But the gap between his sort of conservatism and the conservatism of George W. Bush, I think, is a gigantic one. And even the gap between Prescott and
I think
fair point.
Well, I think John doesn't appreciate how much before '64 the dominant view in America was liberalism. You have in 1950 the famous quote from Lionel Trilling, "The only ideology left in the United States is liberalism." The problem for liberals, though, was that was coming apart. Liberalism was driven by the Roosevelt coalition. And the Roosevelt coalition started to come apart during the Eisenhower years. One element of it was Irish Catholics were moving to the suburbs following the war, the Second World War, and they became more Republican as they moved. Another element was that the South was starting to have rumblings, and of course parts of the South went with Eisenhower, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years before.
Next, the importance of the civil rights movement in the transformation of the American political landscape. The Right Nation, your book, John, you write, quote, "The civil rights revolution turned the bulk of Southern whites into loyal Republicans when it came to presidential elections." The civil rights revolution is what did it. Explain.
I think with the Southern whites, there are two sort of groups of whites who changed. There's certainly a lot of Northern, particularly Catholics, who changed just purely because they don't like what they see in the 60s. But I think particularly with Southern whites, the question of the civil rights thing was key. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, that famous statement about he was signing away the South when he signed the Civil Rights Act. I think people tend to exaggerate the full impact of it. You can see Democrat congressmen, Democrat senators going on for a long time. But at a national level, on the presidential level, you see the Republicans beginning to make gigantic gains in the South. First with Nixon.
Beginning with Eisenhower, really, isn't it?
Well, Eisenhower first, but I think he picked up so much steam after the Civil Rights Act.
Well, I think that's partially true. It did start under Eisenhower. It started under Eisenhower and then slowed down a bit with the Kennedy-Johnson White House, but then picked up under Nixon. Now, Nixon is famous for the Southern strategy, but Nixon also desegregates schools. What he essentially does is he puts race behind the Republican Party. He gets the school issue largely out of the way, and he does it without humiliating Southern whites, something that had become a problem under Kennedy and Johnson. And then that opens the door for all the forces that had been building in the South, the industrialization of the South, the integration of the South into the national economy, the growth of cities like Atlanta, which the migration from the North,
John,
all of which works for the Republicans.
Political scientist Gerard Alexander of the University of Virginia, quote, "We can distinguish between two subregions, the peripheral South, which contained many growing urbanizing areas and much smaller black populations, and the more rural and poorer Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, where black communities were much larger and racial conflict more acute. The myth that links the GOP with racism leads us to expect that the GOP should have entrenched itself first among Deep South whites and only later in the periphery. That prediction is wrong. Yeah. The GOP's breakthrough takes place because it becomes the national party of the middle class, not because of white solidarity."
I think, well, obviously that's true. Statistically, it's true. I think there's a danger, though, in going right into the sort of tiny particularities of the argument. The basic things, if you look at the map of where the Republican Party was winning prior to the Civil Rights Act, and if you look at the 1960 election, there's very few red states. You jump forward 10, 15 years, you're getting a lot of them, and I think that civil rights was a part of it. I think that it's a canard brought up repeatedly by the left that it was purely to do with race. It obviously wasn't, because the same kind of white Southerners who did have problems to do with the Democrats on race also had equally big problems to do with them on a lot of kind of moralistic things, eventually culminating in abortion, but other things to do with Supreme Court judgments or things which were at the time blamed on what they saw as a liberal elite. So I think just purely putting it down to race is too simplistic, but there is, I think, a fundamentally race was a strong part of it.
You get a moment to answer, and then we'll...
There are long strains in Southern thought, apart from race, about independence from the national center. Yeah. The Republicans spoke to that broadly. They spoke to it across the board throughout the country, without regard to race. And that strain, as the Democratic coalition in the South started to come apart, basically as it ceased to be an emblem of opposition to the Union to be a Democrat. The post-Civil War influence, which continued well into the 1960s. As that receded, the Republicans started moving up.
On now to the impact of Ronald Wilson Reagan. Here we have one personality who, for obvious reasons, is worth dwelling on for a moment. What's his legacy? What did he do specifically to the conservative movement? That's the concern of John's book, The Right Nation. What is Reagan's legacy to the conservative movement?
Well, Reagan took the conservative movement over a threshold. It was a kind of movement of mourning before Reagan. It was a movement that contended on equal terms, not always equal terms, within the Republican Party for dominance. And nationally, the Republican moderates and the Democrats overwhelmed it, even when it was strong before Reagan in parts of the Nixon term. And Reagan changed that. When Reagan was done, the conservative movement was the center of gravity in American politics. Everything revolved around it, even American liberalism, which became a reaction. Well,
it's reacting to Reagan.
It is, on one hand, reacting to Reagan, but at the same time, people like Clinton are trying to reconcile liberalism with the language of and some of the precepts of conservatism. The whole Clinton triangulation and third way are attempts to reconcile American liberalism and conservatism in a liberal direction.
John?
I agree with a lot of that. I think there's an argument about the importance of Reagan. You meet some conservatives who go back and say Goldwater was much more important, he started the whole thing. But I think without Reagan, it's very, very difficult to imagine the conservative movement being as powerful as it became. He gave it a much more amiable and a far more optimistic face than other people
I'd go beyond that, John. I'd say he gave it more coherence.
Undoubtedly, he was the first person who really pulled all the different strands together. They could all unite around Reagan because he.
The Reagan Revolution starts with an intellectual revolution, and to a remarkable degree, that intellectual revolution builds around Ronald Reagan himself, and may even have been driven by him. Conservatism had a number of strains, but how they were put together and the relative weight each had, and how each one got expressed in terms of, were you going to go for legislation in this area, or were you going, for example, social issues, or were you going to go for judges? Reagan went for judges. It's somewhat less confrontational. How were you going to deal with the Soviets? How aggressively were you going to weigh taxes versus deficits? All of these choices in economics and foreign policy and social issues were made basically by Reagan, articulated by Reagan in that mix, and driven by Reagan.
He is surely overstating the case. I'm trying to give you a door to walk through.
I think the easiest way,
as you know, I don't dissent from a word of what he just said.
But the easiest way to look at the conservative movement, I think, is not as something where everyone has the same tunic. People don't carry around a little kind of Mao's book of conservatism.
Right.
It's very similar to this idea of a kind of medieval army, where people show up wearing the livery, the tunics of different organizations, Right to Life, guns, anti-tax, and yet what Reagan did, just let me finish, what Reagan did, he was the first person to really get all these people on the battlefield on his side. He gave the impression that they were all his people, and over time he worked his way into all of them. And we mentioned the South, he started to talk about states' rights, but he moved further down to the South, and that began to pull in new elements of the Republican Party.
What he did is he put together a new governing coalition. And like governing coalitions in the United States, traditionally, this one was pretty factious because so many of the elements didn't quite fit. His ability to make them fit, and make them fit after he was gone, was one of his defining characteristics.
Now, gentlemen, we have a little problem here. If conservatism has become, as our guests agree, the dominant intellectual force in American politics, then why hasn't it been more successful in practice? We've agreed very narrowly that conservatism now represents, and has for a generation or two, the dominant intellectual force in American politics, that Ronald Reagan put together a governing coalition, the dominant coalition in American politics. However, I quote to you from your own book, The Right Nation, it is worth admitting that the conservative movement's two main crusades against big government and moral decay have so far been more successful as rallying cries than as policies, close quote. That is to say, if conservatism is so successful, why do we still have the federal government collecting over a fifth of the gross domestic product as taxes? We have 1.5 million abortions performed in the country every year, and so on and so forth. How come?
I think you have to look at it in two ways. First, you have to look at the counterfactual. Imagine there hadn't been a conservative movement. Surely it would have been dramatically bigger. And secondly, I think you have to look at it, and once again, Reagan comes in rather kind of crucially in this way, in terms of shifting the kind of intellectual argument. If you look at Reagan and Thatcher, it's interesting, neither of them actually reduced the size of government as a share of GDP by that much. But in terms of changing the way in which people thought about government, it was a gigantic...
They do both stop the growth.
Yeah, they do both stop the growth.
The line stops.
That's a big thing.
That's right.
Okay,
well,
Buster, so where's the big success of the
Well, first of all, in tax rates, in the entire presumption...
Which were what when Ronald Reagan took office?
70%.
Top rate, and when he left?
28. 28. Tax rates and the entire presumption about the economy, the amount of regulation in it, the amount of intrusion in the attitudes and the policies towards the Soviet Union, all of these areas which were the focus of Reagan's presidency had tremendous changes. Now, on the deficit, the thing to keep in mind is that while the Republicans have sort of a governing coalition, the Democrats still have a powerful coalition, and in Washington, even now, we have, with a Republican Senate and a Republican House and a Republican President, even now we have what we've had basically since 1980, with the 2-year exception of Clinton, divided government.
You, of course, have to explain why, with Republicans in control of all three of those institutions, it's divided.
Sure. The Republicans have the votes to control the agenda in Congress.
Right.
They do not have the control to dominate what is passing.
So you let George W. Bush off the hook for permitting federal spending to rise at 8%
here's
a
what
year
I'd say.
faster than under Clinton.
Yeah, here's what I'd say has happened throughout this period.
Line of attack for you there.
Yeah,
I'd
no.
like to come in on that.
Yeah, well, let me finish here. There's been a compromise among the Republicans and the Democrats on economic policy. The Republicans have wanted lower spending and lower taxes. The Democrats have wanted higher spending and higher taxes. The compromise for 20 years has been higher spending and lower taxes.
All right, look.
John's book identifies obstacles that may stand in the way of a new era of conservative dominance. Let's examine several.
Economic mismanagement. Reagan adds up $1.5 trillion to the national debt, and George W. Bush goes from a surplus to a deficit. Over to you.
Yes, exactly. I think that you're letting Bush off a little bit too lightly. I think that the difference between Bush and Reagan vetoed things, and I don't think you can look at the Bush presidency and say he's got away with it, because it's not all just spending, as we all mentioned earlier, it's not just spending on homeland security and defence, on non-discretionary, on the kind of spending which does not involve those things. It's been increasing even faster than Clinton.
But
that is
true. The thing to keep in mind.
But that represents a necessary compromise.
That's right.
Or some sort of.
Don't underestimate how important it is with W that he didn't win a majority of the popular vote. His strength with that has been that we don't think about it. But the fact is, it's changed the administration.
I think it goes a little bit more serious in that. I think there's a definite worry with the current Republican leadership and with the White House that there's a mistake going on between the mistake between being pro-market and being pro-business, particularly pro-big business. And you see the growth of kind of K Street conservatism. And a lot of the
K Street is what?
The centre of the lobbying community.
K Street conservatism is feeding goods to our board.
If you look at things like the Agricultural Act, you look at the energy bill, you look at a wide variety of things. You look at steel tariffs.
Rich people.
Exactly. These are going through particularly to lobbying ends.
George W. Bush, having lost the popular vote and won by a squeaker in the Electoral College, is he A, giving away all this pork because he deems it a political necessity, Or B, is there some new strand in conservative thinking that's emerging that is much more tolerant of big government?
I think it's two things. I think there's certainly a strong dose of A in it, i.e. political, the political pressure on him to do these things. But I think also B, there is just a possibility with George W. Bush that he is more pro big government than he might first appear. Firstly, when he appeared, he went on a great deal about government didn't necessarily always have to be a problem. It could help a bit.
Contra Ronald Reagan, who said government is the problem.
Precisely. And then secondly, also, I think there's an element of Bush, and you see this particularly on this focus on virtue, on attempts to set up sort of marriage guidance things within departments and stuff like that, whereby he thinks government can do some stuff to help, particularly in social policy, trying to encourage marriage, trying to encourage things like that.
So he actually is more
I think there's a possibility. The jury is out.
You get about 10 seconds to respond because I want to move on to a new.
The jury is out because every area, at least on fiscal policy, where he's expanded government, farm bill, education, all of these, Homeland Security, all of these are responses to the moment. Energy too, actually.
All right. So, in other words, if the man wins big in 2004, we shall see whether he.
That's right. Very much so. Yeah. Very much so.
All right. So this.
On to one more obstacle that may stand in the way of conservative dominance.
What you term in your book, The Right Nation, quote, Southern captivity, perhaps the greatest danger on the road ahead for Republicans, the prospect of seeming intolerant, close quote. What do you mean by that? I say intolerantly. A little joke.
I think there is. I think Reagan again is a very good example. If you look at Reagan, easygoing divorcee, who took I think a much more casual attitude on social issues than George W. Bush. I think there's fundamentally the problem with the Republican Party is you have a Western side and a Southern side. You have a Western anti-government strand. You have a Southern, much more moralistic bit. And when those two bits of the Sun Belt are buckled up, it's highly effective.
But what I'm trying to do is tease out from you whether it's tone or substance. So, for example, Reagan, Clark and I wrote speeches for him. Yeah. When you'd write something, a pro-life statement, it was essential in the Reagan White House to couple it with, it is not for anyone to stand in judgment on anyone else, but move together as a nation. That there's a sense of a warmth and a kind of implicit forgiveness, but that's tone. He was still pro-life.
He introduced, in fact, pro-life into the American debate. It wasn't in the debate until Reagan brought it in.
I still think there's a difference in tone. I mean,
but it's tone. I'm not arguing. I just want to know whether it's substance or tone.
I would detect some degree of substance there on issues to do. I mean, for example, I think of the gay issues. I think Reagan again took a slightly more, or just tried to keep away from them.
It wasn't an
exactly.
Issue, really.
But on the tone, I think the tone is very important. I think the level to which the Republicans now are often perceived as being, say, the party of Trent Lott rather than the party of Schwarzenegger, that actually comes across badly.
Let me push you one last time, and then we'll flip this one to Clark. 1994, the Republican Party recaptures the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years by capturing 54 new seats. Question: of those 54 new members of Congress, how many were pro-life? Answer: 54.
Yeah. I think
where's the danger to the party lie?
Play it both ways, as Clark will probably point out. There is, there's definitely the Conservatives have been remarkably clever at changing the abortion argument. It's now, they pushed it towards subjects like partial birth abortion, areas where there are majorities, so to speak, on the Conservative side. But I think fundamentally,
but you still think ultimately the Republican Party has to go the way of Schwarzenegger, which is kind of a qualified pro-choice.
I think ultimately they've got to give at least the impression that they have room for people like Schwarzenegger. And until they had Schwarzenegger, and that, as you well know, in California, there was not the living chance, snowball's chance of hell. Yeah, but post Pete Wilson, if you went to the Anaheim convention of the Republicans, you would never. There was no chance of those people ever taking on Schwarzenegger as their candidate. It was only the peculiar circumstances of the recall which allowed Schwarzenegger in. And I think if you look at that, that does raise questions.
The Republican Party is doing just fine. However, its principal danger is that it will be perceived as intolerant.
There's some truth to that. But if you look at where you have Republican governors around the country, you look at the coasts, places like New York, Massachusetts, you have Republican governors who are in the heart of, Blue America, and most of whom are pro-choice. You go to the center, you have Republican governors who are pro-life. It hasn't broken apart the party.
Time, gentlemen. Final question. You talked about William McKinley ushering in 3 decades of Republican dominance in 1896. 3 decades from now, will historians look back at the present moment and say, that's when the Republican dominance began? Will we break out of the 50-50 nation that we saw in the last presidential election to achieve substantial and abiding Republican conservative dominance? John?
The only truthful answer is I don't know.
Oh,
but
that's
I think
not allowed on television.
But I think it's very hard to say, not least because this election is going to be so close. But I think the underlying trends are pushing towards the Republicans.
My feeling is elections have moved away from all politics is local to oriented according to not local but national factors. And once that's done, I think that's baked in place for a long time to come. And so while you can break, as Wilson showed and others, you can break a party's dominance, Woodrow Wilson and others, you can break a party's dominance with a split. I think we're looking at a long period of Republican dominance, more or less starting with this coming election.
Clark Judge and John Micklethwait, author of The Right Nation, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.